At the edge of a road cut after heavy rain, the ground opens like a wound. Beneath a few inches of roots and grass, the colour changes abruptly. Brown becomes black. Not rich black like garden soil, but a dull carbon black, packed with cinders, pale fragments of lime, bits of red-fired ceramic, and the occasional piece of glass smoothed by pressure and time. In some places the layer runs flat for hundreds of feet. In others it swells into mounds under trees, beneath farms, below city streets, under old forts, beneath hills people have walked across for generations without asking what, exactly, they are standing on. Soil is supposed to look alive. This looks processed, burned, reduced. And once you notice it, the familiar landscape begins to look less like nature and more like residue. The accepted explanation is simple enough. Soil, we are told, forms slowly from weathered rock, plant decay, animal life, water, roots, fungi, bacteria, and time. Darker soil means more organic matter. Black layers may come from ancient forest fires, peat, flood deposits, volcanic ash, industrial soot, or ordinary human occupation spread over centuries. In cities, the story is even more practical. Streets were raised, buildings were demolished, cellars became basements, fire debris was levelled, covered, and built over. Archaeologists have names for these things, pedologists have categories, engineers have maps, the landscape has a file system. On paper, nothing about it is mysterious. There is geology, there is history, there is development, and beneath all of it, there is soil. But the official explanation starts to thin out when the ground itself is examined at scale. Not just one trench, not one fire site, not one old capital. The contradiction appears when similar black horizons show up again and again, under medieval cores, under abandoned industrial belts, under forest clearings, beneath earthworks, around mountain roads, beside river terraces, below neighbourhoods, whose street grade no longer matches the doors and windows of the structures built along them. The problem is not that black earth exists, the problem is how often it appears mixed with unmistakably human signatures: charcoal, brick dust, bone ash, clinker, mortar, iron droplets, vitrified fragments, phosphate spikes, and compacted layers too thick and too continuous to dismiss as the residue of one fireplace, one barn fire, or one season of dumping. At a certain point, soil stops sounding like an explanation and starts sounding like a label. So the hidden theory is not that the world was built by aliens, or that one mythical empire vanished overnight and left a secret code in the dirt. It is stranger than that because it is smaller, more physical, and more difficult to romanticize. The theory is that a meaningful portion of the ground people now call soil, fill, humus, made ground, or dark earth is, in fact, the weathered ash and combustion residue of older human worlds, burned towns, industrial yards, kilns, furnaces, timber districts, storehouses, roads, walls, workshops, and domestic life, reduced by fire, pulverized by rebuilding, and biologically transformed until later generations stopped recognizing it for what it was. Not hidden in a dramatic sense, hidden by renaming, hidden by time. Hidden because ash, once wetted, mixed, buried, and rooted over, begins to look like earth. The first clue is compositional. True soil is not random. It has structure, horizons, mineral fractions, organic fractions, and a chemistry shaped by climate and parent material. But many dark layers beneath old settlement zones contain things ordinary soil should not contain in such density or distribution. Microscopic charcoal, crushed ceramic, lime flecks, burned bone, spherules formed by heat, elevated phosphorus, a common marker of long human and animal occupation. In some samples there are fused particles that point not to low, diffuse burning, but to sustained temperatures from kilns, smelters, brickworks, or building fires intense enough to alter material at a microscopic level. The record shows that these components are often treated as inclusions inside the soil. But what if they are not inside the deposit as accidents? What if they are the deposit? When a layer is made largely of carbonized matter, mineral ash, and pulverized construction debris, calling it soil may describe what it became, not what it was. The second clue is geometric. Natural topsoil usually thickens and thins according to slope, vegetation, runoff, and time. Burned cultural layers behave differently. They follow former surfaces, they seal older floors, they stop abruptly at walls, they fill hollows in a way that reads less like patient accumulation and more like an event followed by levelling. This is why trench photographs matter. So do foundation exposures, subway cuts, drainage excavations, and hillside slips after rain. Again and again, there are buried thresholds far below present grade, windows that now open into earth, retaining walls whose lower courses disappeared beneath compacted black fill, and entire street lines that make more sense one level down than they do at the current surface. The official explanation says cities rise over time, and they do, but rise with what? Rubble becomes fill, fill becomes subgrade, subgrade becomes ground. The language changes, but the material remains. Old photographs sharpen the problem. 19th century streets in major cities often show buildings whose first visible floor already sits oddly low against the pavement, as if the structure had settled or the street had climbed. In later images, the same buildings appear even more swallowed. Doors become basement entries, half windows become cellar vents. Entire facades lose proportion. Sometimes this is documented street raising. Sometimes it is deliberate grading after sanitation reform or flood control. But there are cases where the photographic sequence suggests something less tidy, districts repeatedly burned, cleared, levelled, and overlaid. The old urban surface erased not by one planned intervention, but by cycles of destruction and practical reuse. Ash and debris were not always hauled away. Often they were the cheapest building material available. What remains is a city standing on its own reduced substance, with later residents inheriting the result as if it were natural terrain. A fair reading of the mainstream explanation is necessary here, because much of it is correct. Cities do bury themselves, roads are raised, fires happen, rivers flood, landslides cover structures. Industrial waste was commonly used as fill. Archaeologists have spent generations documenting occupation layers, destruction horizons, post-fire deposits, and urban dark earth. None of this is imaginary, and none of it requires a lost super-civilization. That explanation successfully accounts for a large number of sites, but it begins to fail when the same material logic appears outside the neat boundaries of recorded urban redevelopment, and when the category used to contain it becomes too broad to be meaningful. If a black, carbon-rich, artifact-bearing layer beneath an old district is called occupation soil, and a similar layer beneath a field is called dark earth, and a similar layer near a fort is called made ground, and a similar layer in a forest is called anthropogenic horizon, then what matters is not the label. What matters is the pattern. The pattern widens fast. In Europe, archaeologists identified dark earth beneath post-Roman and medieval occupation zones, thick, dark, mixed deposits, once dismissed as decay or abandonment, then later recognized as heavily reworked human material. In the Amazon, Terra Preta revealed something even more unsettling. Entire landscapes improved, darkened, and chemically altered by people so thoroughly that what looked like natural fertile ground turned out to be anthropogenic. In industrial regions of Britain, North America, and continental Europe, cinder, ash, clinker, slag, and demolition waste were spread so widely that whole neighbourhoods still sit on them. Mining districts generated artificial hills, brickworks consumed clay and returned red dust and ash to the land. Coal cities breathed soot for a century, and then buried it beneath lawns and pavement. The details differ, the chemistry differs, the dates differ, but the pattern does not disappear. Human fire has been remaking the ground on a scale most people never imagine. Then there are the places where the landscape itself carries the memory badly. Earthen ramparts with suspiciously uniform cores, mounds in wooded areas that produce brick, charcoal, and glass when cut, flat terraces on slopes where no formal record explains the grading. Rural clearings where a plough turns up blackened stone and burned lime year after year. These are easy to ignore because each case can be made ordinary. A farmstead, a kiln, a local fire, a forgotten dumping ground. And sometimes that is exactly what it was. But taken together, these sites suggest a civilizational habit of burning, breaking, spreading, and reusing material so persistent that entire older surfaces were converted into a generalized dark ground, later mistaken for untouched earth. The stone remembers, not in symbols, in residue. Engineering records add another layer. Municipal manuals from the 19th and early 20th centuries treated ash as a problem, but also as a resource. Furnace ash, household ash, street sweepings, clinker from gasworks, and broken brick were routinely used for road base, grading, embankments, yard fill, and land reclamation. Railway expansion consumed vast amounts of fill. Urban sanitation campaigns removed refuse from one district only to deposit it in another. Demolition was rarely a clean subtraction. It was a transfer. Material moved from ruined structure to future foundation. Legal and engineering language helped complete the transformation. Waste, fill, made ground, hardcore, cinder subbase, reclaimed land. These are functional categories. They describe utility, not origin. Once a burned district entered the administrative vocabulary as fill, the historical event that created it became harder to see. What changed was the explanation. The chemistry matters because ash does not simply vanish. Over time, it reacts, it leaches, it binds with clay, it raises pH, it changes water retention, it attracts particular plant communities. Mixed with charcoal, lime, crushed ceramic, and organic waste, it can become strikingly fertile or stubbornly strange. Gardeners know that some dark soils grow with unusual vigor. Environmental surveys know that some conceal heavy metals, persistent contaminants, or anomalous phosphate and carbon signatures. Archaeologists know that burned layers can survive for centuries beneath later deposits. Yet the public imagination still treats ash as temporary, as something light enough to blow away. That is true only for the finest fraction. The heavier truth is different. Burned cities do not evaporate. They settle, they hydrate, they compact, they enter the stratigraphy. The record is still there. Look closely at buried infrastructure and the theory becomes harder to dismiss. There are staircases that descend to nowhere because the level they served was sealed and replaced. There are lower arches beneath streets that function now as basements but were clearly built as entrances or passageways. There are wells and drains whose present relation to the surface makes no hydraulic sense unless the grade around them changed substantially after construction. There are retaining walls that currently retain almost nothing at all, suggesting that the terrain they once managed has been cut back or buried over. Some of this can be explained by renovation, some by subsidence, some by deliberate civic improvement. But when the same signs cluster with black fill, burned fragments, and documentary gaps, the simpler interpretation is often the correct one. An earlier usable surface was destroyed, buried, and normalized. Later generations inherited the anomaly as architecture instead of evidence. The next question is scale. Was this a series of local accidents, or something built into how civilizations destroy and remake themselves? The answer may be uncomfortable because it requires no singular catastrophe. Cities burned often, warehouses burned, fortresses burned, mills, foundries, dockyards, rail depots, armories, tenements, markets, archives, and timber districts all burned. War multiplied it. Industrialization multiplied it again. So did careless heating, gaslighting, dense construction, and weak regulation. Add deliberate clearance, salvage economics, and the simple fact that hauling debris out of a growing city was expensive, and a quiet conclusion emerges. Much of the urban world was repeatedly converted into ground in place. Not once, many times. Civilization did not merely leave ruins, it manufactured substrata. This is where the idea of a dramatic cover-up becomes less useful than the slower machinery of classification. The truth, if that is what it is, may not have been hidden by a secret committee determined to erase the past. It may have been hidden by bureaucracy, by insurance categories, by public works budgets, by property law, by the habit of dividing knowledge into separate rooms where the geologist studies horizons, the archaeologist studies artifacts, the engineer studies load-bearing capacity, and the historian studies documents. While no one is rewarded for stepping back and saying that the thing underfoot is not passive Earth, but processed civilizational residue. Economics has its own censorship. If dark ground is treated as soil, development proceeds. If it is treated as a cultural destruction layer, then liability, contamination, preservation, and public memory all become more complicated. It is easier to rename the deposit than to reopen the question. And the question reaches beyond cities. Forests are often imagined as places where history recedes, where nature covers what humanity leaves behind. But many forests are secondary growth on abandoned fields, charcoal landscapes, old mining zones, military earthworks, lost roads, and vanished settlements. A quiet woodland can root into slag heaps, ash beds, lime-rich demolition spreads, and the weathered remains of ordinary habitation. Mountains carry the same ambiguity. Quarries become hollows, retaining terraces collapse into slopes, burned stone and dark fill slide downslope, and are read later as colluvium, as natural movement. Sometimes that reading is correct, sometimes it is only partially correct. What matters is that the categories are porous. Material crosses from event into terrain, from history into geology, from ash into soil. There is also the matter of time depth. Once a burn layer has been trampled, mixed by roots, burrowed by animals, wetted, dried, frozen, re-wetted, and recolonized by biology for a century or two, it stops looking like catastrophe. It begins to look ancient. This is one reason old destruction can seem implausible to modern eyes. People expect dramatic ruins, standing walls, visible collapse, but most human matter is fragile. Wood goes first, textiles disappear, food stores vanish, paper is gone almost immediately. Even brick fractures, lime slakes, iron oxidizes, ash sinks, then grass arrives, then shrubs, then trees, the surface closes, the memory thins, the next population walks over the site and calls it a hill, a field, a dark patch, a fertile garden, a foundation problem, a strange trench, a place where the ground turns black after rain. The explanation becomes local folklore, then nothing at all. What remains then is not a fantasy of one lost civilization beneath every town, but a more sobering possibility. The civilization beneath our feet may simply be us repeated, older phases of building and burning, forgotten not because they were impossible, but because they were ordinary enough to be reused. The buried layer is not necessarily evidence of a secret empire. It may be evidence of how thoroughly human systems consume themselves and then enter the landscape as if they had always been part of it. This is why the theory is so unsettling. It does not ask us to believe in something magical. It asks us to look at the mundane with enough seriousness to realize that the ground may be an archive of combustion on a civilizational scale. And once that possibility is admitted, familiar places change shape. The dark garden soil behind an old row of houses, the black band in a construction trench, the mound in the woods that never made topographic sense, the buried arch, the first floor window at sidewalk level, the fertile field next to a ruined kiln, the park built on reclaimed land, the fort covered in grass thick enough to hide stone, the mountain road cut exposing charcoal-rich earth beneath clean mineral layers. These are no longer isolated curiosities. They become parts of the same sentence. The pattern repeats: fire, reduction, leveling, reuse, forgetting, then roots, then names, then maps, then certainty. The official explanation is not entirely wrong. Soil is real. Natural processes are real. Floods, peat, volcanic ash, and ordinary occupation all shape the surface. But if the dark ground beneath so many human landscapes contains the mineral, chemical, and structural signature of burning, demolition, reuse, and burial, then soil may be only the final stage of a much more violent biography. The ground you walk on may be less a neutral natural layer than a compressed historical medium, carrying the residue of walls, roofs, fuel, food, tools, animals, paperwork, streets, and lives, reduced to particles too small to be recognized individually. The stone remembers, the charcoal remembers, the chemistry remembers. What changed was the explanation. And that leaves one final reframing. Perhaps the buried civilization beneath our feet is not hidden because someone successfully removed the evidence. Perhaps it is hidden because the evidence was left exactly where it fell, then called by another name until no one thought to challenge it. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.